Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining in on today's call, and thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. As mentioned, I'll be discussing some aspects of what it takes to run a regulatory ambient air monitoring program. Hopefully, those not intending to run a regulatory monitoring site can still get some helpful information here as well. Before we jump in, I wanted to take a moment to go over the topics we will be discussing today. This is by no means the end-all be-all in air monitoring, but it should give you the scope of what needs to be done and provide you with the resources to get the additional information you need to run a regulatory air monitoring program. As you can see on this slide, we have quite a few topics to get through. Some of these may have been discussed in previous calls, so we'll try not to take up too much time on those. So let's begin with the NAAQS, or the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are health benchmarks established to prevent deterioration of public health, your primary standards, and to provide welfare protections such as prevention of crop damage or decreased visibility, which are your secondary standards. They're periodically reviewed by the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee and updated based on current science around once every 5 years. Here we have a table with the 6 criteria pollutants and their primary health standards. To go over the columns a moment, the averaging time is how much data is aggregated to compare to the levels. The level is our primary health benchmark, and the form describes the calculation used. Some are more simple, some are more complicated, and we will discuss later on where to find more information on these standards within the CFR or the Code of Federal Regulations. Now that we understand what our federal standards look like, we can take a moment to look into what regulatory versus non-regulatory monitoring looks like. Regulatory monitoring comes about from a much more rigorous process. Each instrument is tested under a variety of different requirements to ensure that it meets the accuracy and robustness needed for policy making. The instruments used for regulatory monitoring are typically costly, require periodic maintenance, and assessments to support the type of monitoring needed for NAAQS comparison. Along with the use of these specific instruments, regulatory monitoring requires independent checks with devices not used during routine operation. Separate personnel to operate this, and devices that can go back to NIST or National Institute of Standard and Traceability devices. For non-regulatory monitoring, this does not have to go through those rigorous hoops. They do not need to use specific methodologies in their instrumentation, but can still produce data that can help guide communities to make informed local decisions. They typically are much more affordable and provide immediate access to information, but this data does not go through a robust quality assurance program. The sensors typically do not have routine checks or maintenance performed, and often they need periodic replacement. Because of this, it is not used for rule or policy making decisions. It should be noted that elements of a regulatory monitoring program can be incorporated into a non-regulatory program, which could improve the quality of the data collected, but that still does not make the data suitable for NAAQS comparison or regulatory decision making. So here we have a scenario exercise. I'm just going to read it to you, and in the chat box, if you could write whether regulatory or non-regulatory monitoring would be more applicable to this situation. So there's a community organization that wants to increase awareness on the impact of open burning in their neighborhood during the winter months. They want immediate access to this information and intend to run the project for a year or two, which would be more applicable.
And we'll leave the chat open just for a few moments for people to enter in their answers. Christina, so far we have one response that says non-regulatory. Yeah, 2 responses for non-regulatory.
That is correct. So when looking at this scenario, it looks like they want to increase awareness. There's no implication that they want to make any policy or regulatory decisions, and they have a limited scope in that they want the project to run for a year or two. So non-regulatory would make more sense in this situation. Okay, so we'll take our first little mini break. If there's any questions, feel free to raise your hand or just type it directly into the chat box.
So the chat is open for any questions you may have so far. If you're joining us with your audio by phone, you can unmute. And if you've muted through the conference line, you can press *6. Christina, we have no questions in the chat so far.
Okay, perfect. All right, let's keep on going then. So I just want to take a second to talk about criteria monitoring versus toxic monitoring. Some of you may be looking into toxics monitoring to incorporate alongside your ambient air monitoring program. Working with toxics is an expansive endeavor, and it's important to focus on which HAPs or hazardous air pollutants you would like to monitor for. With criteria monitoring, you're limited to the 6 criteria pollutants, while the list of HAPs is currently at 188. Also, only the criteria pollutants have national health standards. Currently, HAPs only have the national emission standards, which function a little differently. They also have more involved analysis methods, which may have you working closely with a lab, and you'll need to verify that those laboratories are also working under the proper methods and have proper quality assurance documents. Besides lead, all criteria pollutants are able to be collected under continuous methods, which require no laboratory collaboration. Still, though, there's a lot of parallels between criteria and toxics monitoring. Both will use established methods, require robust quality assurance, QA, and periodic quality control checks, or QC, and have specific siting requirements that need to be abided by. EPA provides a variety of resources to help establish an air monitoring toxics program, if anyone is interested. You can also contact your technical contact with any questions that may come up as you start your air toxics monitoring. Since we are discussing regulatory monitoring, we still need to talk about the CFR or Code of Federal Regulations. These are the musts of the air monitoring world and provide the regulatory backbone for what we do. I'll talk briefly about 40 CFRs Part 50 and 53 and spend a little bit more time on Part 58, which holds the majority of requirements for regulatory ambient air monitoring. For those not performing regulatory monitoring, Part 58 still holds a lot of valuable information which can be incorporated into your program to improve your data quality. So as mentioned earlier, Part 50 is where you'll find the information on the current NACs and their calculations. It also includes some reference methods on how to calculate concentrations of the criteria pollutants. Part 53 is primarily used by the instrument manufacturers and shows all the requirements which must be met when designing a regulatory ambient air monitoring instrument. Non-regulatory instruments do not have to abide by these requirements. Instruments which meet all of these requirements and are approved methodologies by EPA will either be given an FRM, a federal reference method, or an FEM, federal equivalency method designation code. If your instrument does not have this code, it is not an approved method and cannot be used to collect NACs comparable data or be used in any regulatory decision making. Okay. So Part 58 is the section that holds the bulk of the regulatory requirements used in air monitoring. Here you will find the requirements for an instrument siting, network evaluation, documentation needs, and all the primary quality assurance functions, as well as all other necessary information. For those not performing regulatory ambient air monitoring, you are not required to operate under these set of rules, but they do hold a lot of great information which will improve the quality of your data collected if you can incorporate them into your operations. Saying that, I want to take a moment to go over a couple important aspects of Part 58. First is Appendix E of Part 58, which discusses the siting requirements for regulatory ambient air monitors. There should be no obstructions less than 10 meters from your inlet, which is the point at which the ambient air enters your instrument, and you should have unrestricted airflow of at least 90%, which I will describe a little more in the next slide. For non-regulatory monitors, you do not have to meet all the requirements within Appendix E, but finding locations which follow the appendix will give you the best quality of sampling data. Before moving to the next slide, I want to call attention to the image on the right. The image shows the drip line of a tree, which is the farthest point that the leaves extend past the trunk. When discussing distances to trees, from trees to inlets, we measure to the drip line of the tree, not to the tree trunk or the base. Okay, with that, let's walk through a basic sample siting map. You can see the inlet as a gray triangle in the middle and 3 trees within about the 20-meter area, not to scale. Trees are typically the most common issue found at sites, but anything inlet height or taller would also pose as an obstruction and can be treated similarly. Remembering what we saw in the previous slide, trees needs to be at a minimum 10 meters away from the sample inlet, which means that tree number 1 would have to be removed for this to pass the siting requirements for regulatory monitoring. Tree number 2 looks like it does not obstruct more than 90% of the airflow, but it does have a few branches which go past that 10-meter mark. Since this tree's drip line, which we saw in the previous slide, is less than 10 meters from the inlet, we would need to have this tree trimmed to meet siting requirements. Tree number 3 is beyond 20 meters. Assuming that the tree is farther from the inlet than it is tall, this poses no concern. Of course, measurements should be taken prior to starting sites, and if there are any questions concerning siting requirements, or if a site would be suitable for either regulatory or non-regulatory monitoring, please reach out to your technical contact and we will be more than happy to assist. Okay. Next, let's talk a little on the importance of independent quality assurance for ambient air monitoring. Here, independent really means independent. The quality assurance personnel typically do not operate the primary unit under any capacity unless there are special circumstances worked out with EPA and, at the very least, must use equipment totally independent of routine operations to audit the unit. QA personnel will look at the work performed by field operators, will perform audits which usually have additional requirements and objectives when compared to routine checks, and will go over logbooks, forms, and any other documentation provided by the field personnel, as well as validate the concentration data. For non-regulatory monitoring, this level of independence is not required, but there must be some level of quality assurance to achieve confidence with the data produced. If there are specific questions related to the division between QA and field, please contact your technical contact who can provide additional information and guidance for your particular circumstance. Okay. With that, we'll go into another scenario. So let's say you're trying to establish a QA person in your organization and need to provide justification for that request. Which part of the CFR would you look for those requirements? 50, 53, or 58?
Please enter your answers into the chat. If you are by phone, you may unmute your line and provide an answer. Christina, it looks like you may have stumped some folks. We don't have an answer in yet.
Okay, that's fine. So when looking at most of applicable regulations for ambient air monitoring, they would be found in Part 58. Okay, and with that, we'll do a break for any questions about anything that we've discussed prior to this point.
Christina, we have not seen any questions in the chat thus far. You can give it a second for people to enter any questions into the chat if they may have them, or feel free to unmute your line and ask questions. Christina, there are still no questions in the chat, so feel free to move on when you're ready.
Sounds good. Thanks, Robin. Okay, so now let's take a moment to talk about some of the documents needed to perform regulatory ambient air monitoring and documents which could provide good insight to those who are performing non-regulatory monitoring. AMTIC is an excellent source for all questions QA and covers a variety of topics from general practice to meteorological help, as well as resources for toxics monitoring and technical memos put out by EPA. Okay. From that previous list, I want to take a second to talk about the QA Handbook Volume 2. This handbook is a lengthy read, but does an excellent job in translating the CFR requirements to an easier to digest, readable document. They also have excellent resources on entire electronic logbooks, some sample forms which could be amended to work in both regulatory and non-regulatory capacity, as well as the Appendix D validation templates, which hold the measurement quality objectives, or MQOs, and validation requirements for regulatory criteria monitoring. Many of these MQOs won't translate to non-regulatory monitoring, but it could help for anyone who is trying to set completeness goals or other data quality objectives. So this is going to be a brief overview of what the Appendix D templates look like. You'll see in the top left, they are divided by pollutant and 3 types of criteria: critical, operational, and systematic. Critical are the most crucial requirements and must be met to have valid data for regulatory monitoring. Typically, when these requirements are not met, the data is not comparable and that data must be removed from the data set. Operational criteria is important for maintaining and evaluating the data and could lead to invalidation of suspect data. Systematic criteria are the project data quality objectives, and not meeting these could impact the uncertainty of the data. The Appendix D templates offer a quick guide into the required MQOs and validation procedures for each of the pollutants and includes information such as the minimum frequency and limits of QC checks, audit requirements, and certification frequencies. If there are any questions on how to interpret specific requirements in the Appendix D templates, or if you would like to, if it would make sense to incorporate any of these aspects into your non-regulatory monitoring, please reach out to your technical contact with any questions you may have. Okay. So this slide is for the required documentation for regulatory ambient air monitoring, and at a minimum, you're required to have what's here. So for regulatory monitoring, you do have additional requirements over non-regulatory monitoring, which are highlighted here. For those performing non-regulatory monitoring, we still encourage annual review of your QAPs and SOPs, since these are often written before the project commences. This sometimes leads to differences in what is written versus how things are run, and these documents should really reflect how you are operating your air monitoring sites, whether it's regulatory or non-regulatory. Okay, I want to take a moment to just talk about AQS a second. AQS, or the Air Quality System, is a database used specifically for state, local, and tribal agencies to house the regulatory ambient air data they collect. For the scope of this grant, submittal to AQS is not required. However, since this data is available, it can be used for comparison to both regulatory and non-regulatory monitoring. If there are any questions in how to access this data, please reach out to your technical contact. Okay, and here we have another scenario. During your agency's annual QAP review, you notice that the listed data review project procedures are not reflective of what's currently being performed. Do you have to update your QAP, and do you ask for signature after that update? A bit more of an involved question.
Again, we invite you to submit your answers in the chat. We have one answer from Jenny saying no, since it is not regulatory.
Well, we should always have the QAP be updated for your current procedures. So you should communicate those with your technical contact, and then they can you guys can make a decision together on whether or not you would need new signatures. I don't know if anyone else on the line would have any additional comments on that. Okay. Hearing none. Any questions for anything we've discussed so far?
Thanks, Christina. There have been no questions so far, but if anyone would like to enter any in the chat or unmute a line, then it's open for questions.
This is Brian in Cleveland. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If we are using a regulatory monitor, is it required that data go to AQS, or is that a requirement of this grant?
So for this grant, it's not required, and please, if anyone has any additional information, let me know. I believe you're only supposed to have a way to make that data like public and a central database for you. I don't know if Michelle or Michael, if there's anything else you would like to add.
Hi, Christina, this is Michelle. You and Michael chime in. I believe if you wish for your data to be comparable, it would need to go into AQS. You would need to register and upload your data and follow all of the regulations. The terms and conditions of the agreement and part of the RFA do say that any monitoring data as a result of ARP does need to be publicly available. So whether you're listing that on a website or whatnot, you'll work out when you negotiate the final work plan with your project officer.
All right, thank you.
We have one question from Michelle. Just a reminder, when will the recording for this presentation be available?
Once it goes through 508 compliance and transcription, we're hoping the week of the 26th to have them available.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's the questions that have come in through the chat so far. If there are no more questions, Christina, you're free to continue.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so next, let's take a moment to talk about data flow. So all data collected, whether regulatory or non-regulatory, will have a very similar flow to this. Pre-sample data is any data you need before you start sampling. Field data is your concentration data, as well as any field forms or logbooks created. Verification is a process of checking if your data is correct, and validation is looking at the bigger picture of that data. Did it meet your MQOs that you've set out? For regulatory agencies, were independent audits performed and did they pass? Did any failed or questionable checks lead to invalidated or qualified data, etc.? Data repository is the storing of your data, and your final reporting could either be your end of project report or, for regulatory agencies, annual data certification, which is an involved process where all the data is reviewed and compared against the CFR requirements. When coming up with a data flow for your monitoring system, look at the type of devices that you're using, how you will use this data, and what outcomes you hope to achieve. To emphasize, regulatory work needs a lot of extras that non-regulatory does not require. From specialized equipment to levels of security and additional personnel to perform unique functions, regulatory monitoring is a much more involved and precise operation. Listed here are only some of the unique requirements needed for regulatory monitoring. Okay. Now, before we end this data flow talk, I wanted to discuss PQAOs, or Primary Quality Assurance Organizations. There is no requirement that you need to be in a PQAO, as this is a voluntary agreement between the state, local, and tribal organizations. But joining in on a PQAO helps with the quality assurance portion of the workload. Depending on the individual agreements, the PQAO lead could provide CLAPS, AQS upload, and data validation support to the agency joining in. Again, this is not required and must come from a mutual decision between the joining agency and the PQAO lead. Now, if you can enter into a PQAO, this does not mean you are free from the duties of running an air monitoring site. Common responsibilities include the operation of sites, data verification, and contribution on required documents. This opportunity may not be possible for most here in the meeting, but could be beneficial for a couple of you agencies. Okay. And with that, I wanted to end with a few helpful links. Again, these are not all of the links you will need working in regulatory air monitoring, but it should provide a good starting point for those interested in pursuing this, and also provide some valuable information on best practices for those looking into non-regulatory monitoring. Okay, and with that, are there any final questions for either me or anyone else on this call?
Christina, there are no more questions in the chat. Would anyone like to unmute their line if they have any questions? It looks like no questions so far.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It was a pleasure talking to you all. And if any questions do arise, feel free to reach out. That I know everyone here in the AMAS team, as well as your project officers, we're more than happy to assist. Thank you all very much.